My name is Chase Million. I'm the CEO and founder of Million Concepts, a research and consulting company that develops research support software for a number of fields, primarily planetary science and astronomy. Today, that's based on industry best practices, and that I've developed for use within my company. I've been using this method successfully for years, and I hope that it's helpful to you. I want to thank the Better Scientific Software Organization for supporting this work through a fellowship. I would not have had the time to put this together without their help, so thank you. I'll quickly outline the thesis or hypothesis of this talk. Most of the literature on software project estimation or software project management is written for the context of a business environment. The standards are complete but extremely generic. The books cover a lot of information that most scientists will never encounter in their careers, like complicated org charts or difficult procurement processes, or strict contract terms or big budgets. Often, the things that you optimize against when developing software for a business are much different than what you would do for research. A business might prioritize meeting a delivery date, for example, to beat a competitor to market, whereas a researcher would rather take longer to make sure that the software is really well validated rather than risk publishing something that doesn't hold up. Research projects, interesting ones at least, have no guarantee of success, and failure to achieve the desired outcome is a feature. But failure in business might well get you fired. We, as grant-funded researchers, can still use the best practices developed over decades, but only a small fraction of the total literature is relevant. With a few reasonable assumptions about what kind of research projects we're talking about, it can even be distilled into something simple enough that I can hopefully describe it pretty well in less than an hour. So we need to define the scopes of what types of projects we're talking about. I'm not going to describe in an hour how to estimate your space mission or fusion reactor. You should hire no kidding systems engineers for that. But many research projects will be covered by the following conditions. First, the project should be relatively small by industry standards. My heuristic for this is something like a team of less than 5 people and a total budget less than $1 million. This might seem mid-sized or even big to academics, but it is small compared to like developing transaction software for a bank. Second, the team is composed of domain experts, but the work is new. That is to say that the people on the team have a good general understanding of the field, the problems, possible solutions, etc., but they intend to do the work that is not substantially similar to something they've done before. Many business models involve cranking out copies or near copies of the same type of thing, a website or a car, and the historical information about how long that takes can form the basis of a good estimate. But researchers on the cutting edge don't have this luxury or ability. And finally, the project deliverable should be flexible, which is to say that it's okay if you don't end up delivering exactly the things that you said you would at the start of the project. The due date, which itself is a kind of deliverable, should be flexible, so you can take more time if you need to, but the total budget will be firm. In business contexts, if a project goes over budget, it's often possible to ask the company or client for more money to finish the work. Customers or managers might even use this as a way to constrain overall costs. But for grant-funded research, especially at the scales we're talking about, asking for more money after the research proposal is submitted is completely out of the question. And so you better be certain that you can do the work you need to do with the resources you asked for at the beginning. Many people think that the main point of an estimate is to figure out about how long something will take. Managers or PIs who ask for estimates often think that this is what they want. But this expectation value is actually one of the most difficult things to estimate, and in my opinion, the least useful. Even if you were able to make an accurate estimate of the time it takes to do something, you haven't mostly done the project. If you haven't mostly done the project already, then your estimate will necessarily have huge error bars, and you won't be able to make a good argument for what those error bars are. It will be accurate, but not precise, and in unknown ways. I think more often when people ask for an estimate, what they really want are the outer bounds. First, is this worth doing? And second, how much will it take? The first step of this process sounds simple. Just figure out what you're going to do. It sounds simple, but a lot of people skip this. It's difficult to clearly articulate your needs. It can be stressful to really nail down a problem because it means that there is a problem. It's more fun to jump right into the programming, but it pays off to know what you're doing from the start. And folks have worked out a pretty repeatable process for doing this, almost an algorithm, which I'll describe now. The first step of this algorithm is to write a vision and scope statement. This will be your foundational reference for what it is that you're trying to do. Figure out, if you can, who you'll be working with. We'll call them the stakeholders. We need them to all be involved in this. With their help, write down what you think the problem is and get everyone involved to agree that it accurately represents their understanding. It sounds simple, it can be, but you might often find that it's surprisingly difficult to get everyone on the same page. People can be quite bad at communicating their needs, or two people might use the same words to describe very different things. I've seen a lot of software projects waste time or fail because the developers are simply building the wrong thing from the beginning. You can head off a lot of trouble by spending enough time to get this right. This should be short though. A few sentences is perfect. Definitely not longer than 2 paragraphs. The step after the vision and scope is to create a concept of operations document. Systems engineers usually refer to this as the ConOps. It has a formal IEEE standard, most of which is not useful here. The concept of operations document is not critical to the estimation process, but it is extremely helpful. It's also useful for scoping, designing the project as a whole, and this is a natural place to do it. It can be done in parallel to or in a feedback loop with the vision and scope development. For our purposes, the ConOps is a document that describes the proposed system from the user's perspective. Just talk to the people who will end up using the system or who have the problem that you are trying to solve and write down what they tell you. Try to talk to them enough that you get a complete picture of what they want and need. This kind of thing takes various names and forms that you may have heard, like user discovery or user stories. Critically, the ConOps should describe both the current situation, which is to say the problem and any stopgap solutions to the problem that already exist, and the critical features of the new system. If 2 years from now, exhausted and defeated by this project, you wonder why you're doing it at all, the ConOps should answer that question. Of course, once you've written the ConOps, you should pass it around to the users to verify that you've accurately written what they said or meant. The next step is to generate a requirement specification document. Again, there's no formal IEEE standard for this, there's a formal IEEE standard for this, and the usual term of art is rec spec, but I'm going to distill the idea. For our needs, a requirement specification is a document that outlines the list of verifiable conditions that must be met in order to achieve the vision and scope. These can sometimes be generated directly from the vision and scope documents and the stakeholders' understanding of the problem and solution domains. But it's often helpful to translate the ConOps into concrete requirements. Whereas the concept of operations describes the problem from the user's perspective, the requirements are for the developers. Ask the question, what set of conditions would meet the user's needs? You should define the minimum number of requirements such that a system which meets all of the requirements would do everything that is needed. Requirements are therefore those things which are absolutely critical to the correct functioning of the desired system. By definition, a system which meets all of the requirements will do what is needed and not a single thing more. Now rank the requirements by priority, or by how important they are to achieving the project vision. You should rank them into at least 3 tiers. Critical requirements are mandatory. Stretch requirements would probably make the end result better, but are not mandatory. And nice to haves are other little bells and whistles that may or may not even be worthwhile. How you rank requirements within these classifications is up to you. But having done that, just cross out the stretch and nice to have requirements. If the project objectives can be achieved without them, then they are not necessary and therefore not requirements. I guess you can keep a copy of them around in case you run out of things to do later. Importantly, requirements are what a system must do, not what a system must be. Avoid making design decisions at this phase, by which I mean decisions about how to meet various requirements. For example, unless there are external requirements to use some particular programming language, then the programming language is not a requirement. Put decisions off as long as possible, because as the project goes on, you will get more information with which to make more informed decisions. Another way that I like to think about this is that requirements are conditions that must be met in order to solve a problem, but they do not preordain any particular solution. If your requirements assume a particular solution, then by construction, that solution was determined before all of the requirements were identified, so it's probably not very good. Some common categories of requirements, which you can use as reference or to get an idea about what kinds of things you should be looking for, include accuracy and correctness, or whether the software consistently produces correct output. Reproducibility, that is, does the software consistently produce identical output given identical inputs? Reliability or stability. Security, for example, if you're working with personally identifiable information of research subjects, your software might be required to meet certain security benchmarks. Maintainability, or how easy the software is to keep running over time. Usability, maybe user friendliness. Infrastructure requirements, maybe the software is being developed for a specific high performance computing environment, and there are requirements for what kinds of software can be run on it or what that software can or can't do. And contractual or administrative flow-down requirements, like maybe the policies of your organization or funding agency. Of these, in my opinion, accuracy and reproducibility are the most important in research environments, which is a little bit different than most business environments, where probably reliability and usability would be prioritized more often. Now that you have the requirements, it's okay to start thinking about possible solutions. Imagine some system or set of systems that would meet all of your requirements. It's good to think of several and debate their relative merits among developers and stakeholders. This might take a while, but it can also be a lot of fun. It is the creative design process. Pick your best idea, but keep a record of all the other ideas. They might be useful someday. Once you've agreed upon an approach, break the implementation of the solution down into sub-projects and tasks. The line between sub-project and task is fuzzy, but can be useful for organizing the estimate and project as a whole. A sub-project is a project unto itself. Given well-defined inputs and outputs, it could be separated from the rest of the project and done independently. Tasks are components of projects that are distinct efforts, but too interrelated with other tasks to be fully separable. Smaller projects may not contain any sub-projects. Larger projects may contain many. A critical property of a task is that it is something that you can conceive of doing. These should be bite-sized chunks of work that you can wrap your head around. I like to think of these as achievable goals. Each task is something that on its own, I would guarantee that I could deliver. You should look at each one and think, I could do that. You only need to be confident that you could accomplish the task as a whole, even if you're fuzzy about how you might go about it. If the task is to get across town, then you only need to know that you could. You don't need to know whether you'd walk or take a bike or a bus or a car, or even how to do any of those things or what streets you take. It's enough to know that transportation methods exist and are available. Although you should be doing this with a specific solution or implementation in mind, you should still avoid making design decisions if possible. It's always better to wait until the project is underway and you have more information. The tasks should each be large enough that there's not too much interdependence, but sometimes it can't be avoided. Sometimes tasks depend on each other in a way where you really need to know what one is before you can figure out what another one might be. As a general guideline, about a dozen or between 10 and 20 tasks is about the right number for most projects of the size that we're talking about. This is pretty consistently the guidance throughout the literature and also agrees with my own experience. Fewer is probably unlikely to be helpful for our needs, but you might need more, especially if you're a new programmer or there are parts of the project that are tricky. You might need to break it down more in order to get to the point where you can imagine doing each one. Importantly, and you'll want to double check your work on this. The task should be complete in the sense that achieving all of them will fulfill your project requirements. It's easy to remember the big things that you'll be doing for a project, but there are a bunch of smaller ones or semi-invisible things that add up to big fractions of projects, but are easy to forget. These are just some that I have to remind myself to include, usually because I messed it up in the past. Writing documentation takes time. IT management, so that includes installing software, managing dependencies, defining and deploying virtual machines. Data organization, like defining file formats or databases, accessing data, moving data around, writing documentation for data. Software packaging, like getting things onto PyPy, which many of us know can be a pain. Dissemination of results includes preparing and giving conference presentations, writing papers, communicating to stakeholders, like reading and responding to emails over the course of the project, keeping everyone informed and happy. Some of those communications will be in the form of bug reports or feature requests. And even if you don't need to act on these, sometimes you don't, you still need to deal with them. Look into them, document them, and that takes time. And then just the constant demands of project management and administration. This includes filling out forms, annual reports, or, as I suggest that you do, re-estimating the project from time to time to make sure that things are going okay. Step 3, now go down the list of tasks and make an initial estimate, just based on a gut feeling, if that's all you have, of how much each time each task will take. Your initial estimates should be at least a few hours for most tasks. If you're coming up with initial estimates for a lot of things that are less than 4 hours, then you're probably being too optimistic about how long things take, or you subdivided your task too much. Nothing should take less than an hour. Note that this is the time spent actually working, so don't include things like how long it takes to run a big simulation that does not require your constant attention. If they are available, the people who will do the work should be the ones making these judgments. If 2 or more people will be involved in the task, then they should discuss and arrive at a consensus. But the consensus should not be a compromise. If one person thinks a task will take 2 hours, and another person thinks the task will take 10 hours, and neither of them can be convinced that their own judgment is clearly wrong, take the larger estimate rather than splitting the difference. Go with 10 hours. The reason is that there is a limit to how quickly a task can be completed, but there is no limit to how long it can take. The truth is therefore more likely to lie in the direction of pessimism. People sometimes also consciously or unconsciously fudge their own estimates downwards because they imagine that someone more experienced or more senior or smarter or better could do the work faster. So maybe they feel that they should be able to do that, or they should at least not get paid for doing it slower. Banish those thoughts. Make an honest first estimate. It is probably true that someone else could do it faster, but unless that person is available and willing to do it, then it makes no difference. If you don't know who will be doing the work, maybe it's going to be some future grad student or postdoc, then I suggest that you imagine that whoever ends up doing it will be sort of mediocre. Estimate from that basis. Maybe assume that they are half as good as you or only as good as your least competent colleague. Of course, we all hope to hire and work with the best people, but sometimes we don't have control over that. And even good people perform poorly sometimes for perfectly valid reasons. Next, judge your confidence in those estimates. For every task estimate in the previous step, assign a confidence rating of between 1.2 and 4. 1.2 is for tasks that are very similar or identical to something you've done before, and for which there is little question about how to proceed. Assign a 4 to tasks that are entirely novel. Don't bother using more precise fractions, just 1.2, 2, 3, and 4. The extra quote-unquote precision won't gain you anything. Note that the lower number is not exactly 1. This is because people underestimate how long things take, even things that they have done before, unless they've done careful tracking of their previous effort. It's pretty safe to assume that everything will take longer than you think. And as before, the people who will actually be doing the work should be making these assessments. Use your mental model of mediocrity and never split the difference. So now to the estimates. The sum of your initial estimates for all tasks, in some sense, is your estimate for how long the project would take if everything went exactly according to your expectations. We'll take this to be the best case scenario. It's the minimum required work necessary to do the project in the best case. For many software projects, the work effort will be the main driver of project cost. So you can take this best case estimate, multiply it by whatever the fully loaded costs of your team members are, and you'll have an estimate of the total amount of money required to do the project. If this is more money than you have or can ask for, then the project is probably not feasible. You should go back to the beginning and try to be less ambitious with scope, or maybe give up the idea altogether. The sum of initial estimates multiplied by their corresponding confidence factors is what we will call the actual project estimate. This is the amount of resources that provides for a good chance of project success, as long as nothing major was left out in the process. Although it can feel sort of ethereal, this number is not a guess and it's not padded. The approach we used to get here was derived from literature on the best practices for software project estimation. By dint of the method, this number is reasonable and it should be sufficient. These are typical merit criteria for research proposals, that the requested resources are both reasonable and sufficient. So this is the number that you put in your proposal. Keep in mind that all estimates are wrong. When you make an estimate, especially at the outset of a project or in the proposal phase, you are trying to figure out how much it will take to accomplish some difficult, complicated task at a time when you have the least information about it. This is almost futile. And estimates are also not predictions. They're not supposed to be predictions. Even if they were, then the best that they could do is accuracy without precision. You should judge your estimates by how useful they are, not by how accurate they are. In the case we're talking about, smallish software projects as part of grant-funded research, the estimate is useful if it helps you request sufficient resources without being unreasonable. You should also revisit your estimate from time to time. Go back to the beginning and start again. You should definitely do this whenever the project scope or objectives or context changes, but also maybe yearly, so that you can see whether you are still likely to achieve success with the allocated resources, and maybe make some adjustments to keep the project on track. I have recommendations for how to do this, but it'll have to be at a different time. At some point, you'll encounter someone, maybe yourself, who wants to treat your estimate as the opening salvo of a negotiation. You might go through the process and find that you need 500 hours of work, but can only request support for 350 hours. Or you'll tell your boss 500 hours and he asks you to do it in 250. Maybe you'll think that you can just work harder, make up the difference somehow. You might think it's better to just close the deal or make your advisor happy and that you'll figure it out later. Do not do this. Never negotiate an estimate. You'll be setting yourself and the project up for failure. Instead, in these situations, you can negotiate the scope of the project and then reestimate. If the project is going to take less time, then it must do less. Alternatively, you can try to negotiate the available resources. If the project is going to do more, then it needs more. But the estimate itself is not open for negotiation. Also, I said this before, but it's worth mentioning again, that the estimate is not the plan. Specifically, the amount of budgeted work effort that we've just calculated is not the same as the amount of calendar time that it will take to complete the project from start to finish. If you need 4,000 hours or 2 FTE for the project, it does not necessarily mean that one person can or should finish the project in 2 years of working flat out. There are many reasons for this. I'm sure you can come up with some, but one is that a lot of project tasks will only be possible to complete in sequence because elements of one task are inputs to another. Another is that you might need to wait for inputs almost entirely external to the project. You can call them bottlenecks, like responses from colleagues or specific data to be collected by space telescopes or on field work. The upshot is that the work effort that we've calculated, or billable time as I think of it, is almost always much smaller than the calendar time from project start to finish. I also have recommendations for how to use the estimate as the basis for the plan, but that'll also be a different talk. So here are a few books that I recommend. These informed all of my thinking on this. Software project estimation is probably the classic work on the topic. It covers almost everything I've covered here and more. Software estimation without guessing is somewhat newer. It's also excellent. It's very approachable. If you write a lot of software in exchange for money, you should probably read one or both of these books. The IEEE standards are just the formal references for ConOps and RecSpec. Both of these are more extensible and strictly defined than what I've described. Thinking Fast and Slow has a lot to say about how people make decisions and judgments and how we can be less bad at that. Like, for example, it's better to have models that are simple and wrong than models that are complex and wrong. Science in action is one of the standard texts in technology studies. There are many others that I could have put here, but I just think it's valuable to study the ways in which scientists go about doing science if we're going to create tools to help them. And finally, Moby Dick, just because I like it, and if you can read Moby Dick, you should. And I'd like to thank the Exascale Computing Project, the US Department of Energy, and the Nuclear Security Administration, who are sponsoring the Better Scientific Software Fellowship, which supported this work and allowed me to put this together. And then for your screenshotting use, here's just a one-slide summary of the entire algorithm. You can screenshot this and use this as a reference. And I'd be happy to take questions now. Thank you.